The lace on Eleanor Vance's wedding dress felt like a beautiful, delicate cage. Each tiny, perfect stitch seemed to bind her a little tighter to a life chosen for her. If you believe in our mission to unearth these forgotten histories, consider supporting us with a super thanks. And if you already stand with Eleanor, leave a "Stay strong, Eleanor" in the comments below. It was June of 1951 in Harmony Creek, Georgia, and the air in the small vestibule of the First Baptist Church was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of expectation. Through the crack in the door, she could see the pews packed with the town's finest, their faces turned toward the front, waiting for the culmination of the season's most anticipated social event, the marriage of Eleanor Vance to Mr. Alistair Finch. Alistair was, by every conceivable measure, the perfect match. He was the sole heir to the Finch banking fortune, a man whose family owned half the county and held a mortgage on the other half. He was handsome in a severe, polished way, his blonde hair always perfectly parted, his suits impeccably tailored. He had courted her with a quiet, confident persistence, offering her a future of security and status that was beyond the wildest dreams of a grocer's daughter. Her mother had wept with joy when he proposed. Her father, a practical man worn down by years of struggle, had shaken Alistair's hand with a reverence usually reserved for the Lord himself. For her family, this marriage was not a union of love. It was a deliverance. It was the end of worry, the end of scrimping and saving, the end of being on the wrong side of the bank counter. Eleanor smoothed the satin of her dress with a trembling hand. She should be happy. She should be overcome with gratitude. She was 23 years old, and she was about to become the most powerful woman in Harmony Creek. But her heart, the part of her that still remembered another life, another love, felt like a locked room, the key long lost. For 5 years, she had been so careful. She had built walls around that room, brick by painful brick. She had learned to smile when her friends talked about their own courtships, to nod politely when Alistair spoke of their future, to silence the ghost who lived in the deepest part of her memory. The ghost had a name, Samuel Barnes. He was not a man who belonged in the sunlit, lily-scented world of the First Baptist Church. His world had been one of pine needles and creek water, of stolen moments in the twilight behind her father's store, of a love that was as powerful and as forbidden as a summer storm. He was the son of a sharecropper from the colored side of the river, a young man with eyes that held the whole sky and a laugh that could make the world feel new. They had grown up in the same small town, but in different universes that were never meant to intersect, but they had. In the hushed secrecy of their late teenage years, they had found each other, and for a brief, magical time, the rules of Harmony Creek, Georgia, had simply ceased to exist for them. He had enlisted in the army in the spring of 1946, just as the last of the boys were coming home from the war in Europe. There were no jobs, no opportunities for a young black man in Harmony Creek, and the army was a way out, a chance to be something more than a sharecropper's son. The night before he left for basic training, they met in their spot by the creek. The air was soft with the promise of spring, and the peepers were singing their nightly chorus. He had taken her hands in his grip strong and sure. "I'm gonna make something of myself, Ellie," he'd whispered, his voice thick with a fierce determination. "I'm gonna be a man you can be proud of, a man who can ask for your hand properly, in the daylight, in front of God and everybody. You wait for me. You just wait for me. I'll come back for you. I swear it on my soul." She had waited. For the first year, his letters came faithfully, postmarked from Fort Benning and then from bases she had never heard of, filled with stories of a world bigger than she could imagine, filled with promises that sustained her through the lonely days. Then the letters had slowed, and then they stopped altogether. She wrote and wrote, her letters filled with a growing panic, sending them to the last address she had, but they were met with a crushing, absolute silence. Weeks turned into months, months into a full year. She haunted the post office, her heart leaping at the sight of the mailman, only to have it shatter again and again when there was nothing for her. Her family, who had never known the depth of her feelings for Samuel, saw only a young woman pining for a boy who was beneath her station. "He's forgotten you, Eleanor," Eleanor," her mother had said, her voice a mixture of pity and relief. "Those boys go off to faraway places. They see the world. They don't come back for girls like us. He's found himself some city girl now. You have to move on." Eventually, the pain had hardened into a quiet, permanent ache. She had allowed herself to believe them. He had forgotten her. He had moved on. And so, slowly, painfully, she began to do the same. When Alistair Finch had started to call on her, she had been surprised, then flattered, then resigned. He was kind in his way. He was respectable. He was safe. And safety, she had learned, was a powerful anesthetic for a broken heart. She had accepted his proposal not with a surge of joy, but with a sigh of surrender. She was tired of waiting for a ghost. She was tired of the whispers about the grocer's daughter who was going to end up an old maid. She was tired of seeing the worry in her father's eyes every time he tallied the accounts. Alistair was not a passion, he was a solution. "Eleanor, honey, it's time." Her father's voice pulled her back to the present. He stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of pride and nervousness, his best suit looking a little too tight across the shoulders. He held out his arm. She took it, the fine wool of his jacket rough beneath her gloved fingers. She took a deep breath, pushing the ghost of Samuel Barnes down into the locked room, and turned the key. This was her wedding day. This was her new life. The organs swelled, the triumphant notes of the wedding march filling the church. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and she and her father began the long walk down the aisle. The faces of the townspeople turned to watch her, a sea of smiles and admiring glances. She kept her eyes fixed on the altar, on the figure of Alistair waiting for her, his back ramrod straight. She saw the stained glass window behind him, depicting a serene, benevolent Christ, his arms outstretched. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Perfect, orderly, safe. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Alistair's. His hand was cool and dry, his grip possessive. She risked a glance at his face. He was smiling, a thin, satisfied smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a man who had just acquired his most prized possession. The preacher, Reverend Miller, began to speak, his voice a familiar, comforting drone. Eleanor's mind drifted. She heard the words, but they seemed to be coming from a great distance. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God." She thought of the creak, of the feel of Samuel's hand in hers, of the impossible, reckless joy of their secret love. A single, traitorous tear welled in her eye. She blinked it away, angry at herself, at the ghost she could not seem to exorcise. If any person can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let them now speak, or else hereafter forever hold their peace. The traditional words hung in the silent, sun-drenched air of the church. The congregation held a collective breath, a customary ceremonial pause. 1 second, 2, 3. The preacher opened his mouth to continue. And then, from the back of the church came a sound. It was not a shout. It was not a protest. It was the heavy, groaning creak of the main door being pushed open against its ancient hinges. Every head in the church swiveled around. A collective gasp, a ripple of shock and disbelief went through the pews. Alistair's hand tightened on hers, his fingers digging into her skin. Even Reverend Miller stopped, his mouth agape. Eleanor turned, her heart suddenly a wild, terrified bird beating against the cage of her ribs. A figure was standing in the open doorway, a dark silhouette against the brilliant, blinding light of the June afternoon. He stood for a moment, letting the door swing shut behind him, and as her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the church, the silhouette resolved into a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, standing with a stillness that was both powerful and weary. He was dressed in simple, worn clothes, not the uniform she remembered. His face was older, thinner than she recalled, etched with lines of hardship she couldn't begin to comprehend. But the eyes were the same. They were the eyes that held the whole sky. It was Samuel Barnes. The silence in the church was a physical thing. It was absolute, so total it had a sound of its own, a high, thin ringing in Eleanor's ears. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The world had frozen on its axis, trapping them all like figures in a photograph. The shocked preacher, the furious groom, the stunned bride, and the ghost at the back of the church. The collective gasp of the congregation seemed to hang in the air, shimmering in the shafts of colored light that fell from the stained glass windows. Then the world lurched back into motion. Alistair's grip on her hand became a vice, his knuckles white. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the back of the church, his handsome face transformed into a bloodless mask of cold fury. He was a man whose perfect world had just been defaced with a piece of vulgar graffiti, and his first instinct was not to understand, but to erase it. "Reverend Miller," Alistair said, his voice a low, dangerous command that cut through the silence. "Continue with the ceremony." It was an act of supreme arrogance, an attempt to will Samuel Barnes out of existence, to pretend this shocking interruption was nothing more than a draft from an open door. But Samuel would not be willed away. He took a single step forward, over the threshold and into the main aisle of the church, and then another. He began to walk, his pace unhurried, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He was not running, he was not shouting. He was simply advancing, a solitary, undeniable fact, walking into the heart of their carefully constructed fiction. A murmur, low and venomous, rippled through the pews. It was a sound Eleanor knew well, the sound of Harmony Creek passing judgment. Whispers of "Who is that?" from the younger guests were quickly answered by the knowing, scandalized hisses of the older generation. "It's the Barnes boy, Jedediah's son, from across the river." "Wardle." The words were spoken as if describing a creature from another species, something that had wandered into a place it did not belong. He was crossing more than the length of the church. He was crossing a line that had been drawn in the town's very soul for 100 years, an invisible barrier of race and class that was meant to be impassable. Eleanor watched him come, and her mind was a whirlwind of chaos. 5 years of silence, of unanswered letters, of a grief she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it was dead. And now, here he was, the questions she had screamed into her pillow at night, the accusations she had hurled at his memory, the desperate, aching need to understand. It all came rushing back, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. Why had he left her in that crushing silence? And why, in God's name, had he chosen now, this specific, public, catastrophic moment, to return? He was halfway down the aisle now. She could see his face clearly. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by the hard-won maturity of a man who had seen things she could not imagine. There was a thin, white scar above his right eyebrow that hadn't been there before. His eyes, however, were unchanged. They were fixed on her, and on her alone, a gaze of such focused, desperate intensity that it seemed to burn away everyone else in the church. He wasn't looking at Alistair. He wasn't looking at the shocked faces in the pews. He was looking only at her, and his eyes were asking a question. Her father, standing beside her mother in the front pew, looked like he was about to be sick. His face, which had been beaming with pride just moments before, was now a pasty grey. This was his worst nightmare. The foundation of his family's secure future was cracking before his very eyes. Eleanor saw her mother clutch her father's arm, her knuckles white, her expression one of pure, unadulterated horror. In the pew opposite sat the Finches. Alistair's father, a grim, hawk-nosed man, was staring at Samuel with an expression of open contempt, as if he were an insect to be crushed. But it was Mrs. Finch, a woman carved from ice, whose gaze was the most terrifying. She was looking at Eleanor, and her eyes were filled with a cold, murderous promise. Samuel stopped. He was about 20 feet from the altar, close enough for her to see the weary slump of his shoulders, far enough to remain out of Alistair's immediate reach. The murmuring of the crowd died away, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Everyone was waiting to see what the ghost would do, what he would say. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the same low, steady tone she remembered from their nights by the creek, a voice that was meant for her and her alone, yet it carried with perfect clarity to every corner of the silent church. "Ellie," he said, just her name, the name no one else had called her since he left. "I came back, just like I promised. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. I promised, the promise that had been her entire world. The promise she had clung to until her hope had withered and died. The promise she had finally renounced in order to survive. He said it so simply, as if there hadn't been a 5-year abyss of silence between the making of it and this moment. Before she could process it, before she could even breathe, Alistair acted. "Eleanor, do not look at him," he hissed, his fingers digging painfully into the delicate skin of her arm. He tried to turn her, to physically force her to face the altar again, to face him. This is a pathetic display. This person has no right to be here. He raised his voice, projecting it over her head toward Samuel. "You have 2 seconds to get out of this church before I have Sheriff Miller escort you to a jail cell where you belong." But Samuel's eyes never left Eleanor's. "I'm not talking to him, Ellie," he said, his voice still quiet, but now underscored with a raw, pleading edge. "I'm talking to you. I wrote to you. I wrote hundreds of letters. Did you ever get them? Did you ever get a single one?" Hundreds of letters. The world tilted. She had written to him over and over, into a void. The idea that he had been doing the same, that their words had been crossing in some dead letter office of the heart, was too much to comprehend. "No," she whispered, the word a faint puff of air. "No, I never got anything." "I figured," Samuel said, and a look of profound, weary sadness passed over his face. He knew. He had expected this. "This is insane," Alistair spat, his control finally snapping. He dropped her hand and took a step forward, his body shielding her from Samuel's view, claiming his territory. "This wedding is proceeding. Reverend, I will not tell you again." He pointed a trembling finger at Samuel. "And as for you, your presence here is an insult. An insult to me, to my family, and to this woman. Now get out." The word hung in the air. This woman, not Eleanor, not his beloved bride. This woman, a piece of property that had been sullied, a possession that was being challenged. In that single contemptuous phrase, Alistair revealed the truth of his heart. She was a thing to be owned, to be displayed, a beautiful addition to the Finch dynasty. And in that moment, something inside Eleanor snapped. The years of carefully constructed walls, of polite smiles and quiet resignations, crumbled to dust. The ghost she had tried to lock away was not a ghost at all. He was a man who had come back for her, against all odds, against all logic, braving the fury of this entire town, to stand in this church and look her in the eye. He had kept his promise, and she had been about to break hers. Alistair reached for her hand again, his face a storm of rage and wounded pride. "Eleanor, we are finishing this." She looked from his furious, possessive face to Samuel's, which was filled with a desperate, questioning hope. She looked at her parents, their faces a mask of pleading and fear. She looked at the Finches, their expressions hard as granite, and she knew that this was the single most important moment of her life. It was a choice between a safe, comfortable, gilded cage and a dangerous, uncertain, terrifying freedom. It was a choice between the woman they all wanted her to be and the woman she truly was. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor raised her hand, not to take Alistair's, but to pull her own hand back, away from his grasp. It was a small movement, but it was an earthquake. It was a declaration of independence. She took one step back from the altar, creating a space between herself and the man she was supposed to marry. The wedding was not proceeding. The wedding was over. The silence that followed her movement was the sound of a life-shattering and another impossibly beginning. Alistair stared at the empty space where Eleanor's hand had been, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and outrage, as if a prized statue he owned had suddenly stepped off its pedestal. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dangerously low, "what do you think you're doing?" She didn't answer him. She couldn't. Her entire being was focused on Samuel. He had not moved, but the hope in his eyes had intensified, becoming a fragile, brilliant flame in the dim light of the church. She took another step back from the altar, the rustle of her satin dress sounding like a roar in the dead silence. Each step was a severing, a cutting of the 1,000 invisible threads that had bound bound her to this life, to this man, to this town. Her father was on his feet now, his face ashen. "Eleanor, for the love of God," he pleaded, his voice a choked whisper that carried across the front pews. "Think of what you're doing. Think of your mother. Think of our family." His words were meant to be a lifeline, a call back to reason and duty, but all they did was remind her of the cage. She looked at her father, at the desperation in his eyes, and she felt a surge of pity, but it was overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. Her entire life had been about thinking of her family, of their needs, of their reputation. She had been willing to sacrifice her own heart on the altar of their security, but no more. Samuel's presence had reminded her that she had a heart to sacrifice, a self that was separate from their expectations. She turned her gaze back to Samuel. The questions that had been a chaotic storm in her mind just moments before now coalesced into a single, urgent need. "The letters," she said, her voice stronger now, clearer. "You said you wrote. I don't understand." Before Samuel could answer, a new voice, cold and sharp as splintered ice, cut through the air. It was Alistair's father, Harrison Finch. He rose slowly from his seat in the front pew, a man accustomed to absolute authority, a man who had never in his life had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "This farce is over," he said, his eyes sweeping over the scene with utter contempt. He looked directly at Samuel, his gaze a physical blow. "Sheriff Miller, I believe my son has already made a request. I am now making it an order. Remove this trespasser from the church, immediately." Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set man who also served as a deacon, was trapped. He looked from Harrison Finch, the man who owned the bank that held the mortgage on his house, to Samuel, a young man he had known since birth. He started to move, his steps reluctant, his face a mask of misery. But Samuel stood his ground. He finally took his eyes off Eleanor and looked at Harrison Finch. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet, weary dignity. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "this is between Ellie and me. It has nothing to do with you." "Everything in this town has to do with me," Harrison Finch replied, his voice dripping with the casual arrogance of absolute power. He then turned his chilling gaze on Eleanor. "And you, young lady, you are about to make the biggest mistake of your life. You will put your hand back where it belongs. You will finish this ceremony, and we will all forget this embarrassing little interruption ever happened. The alternative is something I assure you, your family is not prepared to withstand." It was not a suggestion. It was a threat, bold and undisguised. He was reminding her of the power he held, the power to ruin her father's business, to call in every loan, to cast her family out into the cold. He was telling her that her choice was not just about her own happiness, but about the survival of everyone she loved. The invisible cage had suddenly become very real, its bars forged from debt and obligation. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. She looked at her father again. He was wilting under Harrison Finch's gaze, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew, better than anyone, that Finch was not making an idle threat. The dream of deliverance was turning into a nightmare of retribution. It was in that moment of crushing pressure, with the weight of her family's future pressing down on her, that she found an unexpected strength. Harrison Finch thought he could buy her, threaten her, control her. He thought she was just another one of his assets. But Samuel's return had reawakened a part of her that could not be bought, a part that had survived 5 years of starvation and was now roaring back to life. "Why?" she said again, her voice ringing out, clear and defiant, turning away from the Finches, away from her parents, to face Samuel directly. "If you wrote, why did I never hear from you? Why did you let me believe you were gone?" Samuel took a deep breath, his gaze holding hers. "Because I wasn't just in the army, Ellie. I was in a place where they don't let you write letters. I was in a place they don't tell families about." He paused, and the words he spoke next fell like stones into the silent church. "I was in military prison." A new shockwave went through the congregation. Prison. The word was a stain, a mark of shame that could never be washed away. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. Samuel, the gentlest soul she had ever known, in prison. It was impossible. What did you do?" she whispered. "What I was told," he said, a bitter irony lacing his voice. "I was stationed down in Texas. My commanding officer was a man from Mississippi. He He didn't like taking orders from colored soldiers, even ones who outranked him. There was an argument. He used a word he shouldn't have used. I told him to stand down. He came at me. I defended myself. And in their eyes, a black man defending himself against a white officer isn't self-defense. It's mutiny. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it made her ache to see it. They gave me 5 years at Leavenworth. 5 years, Ellie. I wrote to you every week for the first year. Before they took my mail privileges away, I gave the letters to the chaplain to mail. He promised me he would. The truth, when it came, was uglier and more painful than anything she could have imagined. He hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been stolen from her, stolen by an injustice so profound, so monstrous, that it took her breath away. He had been paying a price for his dignity, for his very manhood, locked away in a cage, while she, in her own gilded one, had been losing faith in him. The chaplain, she began, her mind seizing on the detail. Who was he? Where was he from? I don't remember his name, Samuel said, shaking his head. But I remember him telling me he was new to the army, said he was from a small town back east. Harmony Creek, I think he said. The air left Eleanor's lungs in a rush. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. A chaplain from Harmony Creek. A chaplain who would have known her family, who would have known the Finches. A chaplain who would have understood the unwritten laws of their town, who would have seen a bundle of letters from a black prisoner to a white grocer's daughter not as a sacred trust, but as a problem to be solved. Her letters to him had likely met the same fate. They had been intercepted. They had been silenced. Their love had been deliberately and systematically erased. She looked at Harrison Finch. His face was a stony mask, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a glint of cold reptilian satisfaction. He had known. She didn't know how, but she was certain of it. He, or someone acting on his behalf, had pulled the strings, had made sure the silence between her and Samuel was absolute, clearing the way for his son. The whole world shifted. This was not a story of a lost love and a tragic misunderstanding. This was a story of a theft. They had stolen 5 years of her life. They had stolen Samuel's freedom. They had stolen their future. And now they were standing here, demanding that she ratify that theft by marrying the man who had benefited from it. Alistair, seeing the tide turning, seeing the story shift from his humiliation to Samuel's injustice, stepped forward again. "This is a ridiculous, unproven story," he declared, his voice loud and blustering. "He's a convicted criminal, a mutineer, trying to ruin our wedding day with pathetic lies. Eleanor, you cannot possibly believe this." "It doesn't matter what I believe," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it was filled with a chilling certainty. "It matters what he believes. He believes he kept his promise, and he came here today believing I would keep mine." She finally turned to face Alistair, to face the life he represented. She looked at him, at his handsome, furious face, and she felt nothing. No love, no anger, not even pity, only a vast, empty distance. "I'm sorry, Alistair, I can't marry you." She began to walk, not back, not away, but forward, down the 2 steps from the altar. She walked past her stunned and weeping mother. She walked past her broken father. She walked past the glowering, hateful faces of the Finches. She walked with a grace and a purpose she had never possessed before. The beautiful, expensive dress, the symbol of her intended life, trailed behind her like the ghost of a future she had just killed. She walked down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Samuel, the one true and unchanging point in her collapsing world. The people in the pews shrank back from her as she passed, as if she were carrying a disease. In a way, she was. She was carrying the truth, and in Harmony Creek, the truth was a contagion. She reached Samuel, and without a word, she placed her hand in his. His hand was warm and calloused, and his grip was just as strong as she remembered. It was the only thing in the world that felt real. Together, they turned and walked out of the church, leaving behind the wreckage of 2 families and the stunned silence of a town that had just witnessed the impossible. Stepping out of the heavy, incense-laden air of the church and into the brilliant June sunlight was like being born into a new and terrifying world. The light was blinding, the air shockingly fresh. For a moment, Eleanor was disoriented, her hand clutching Samuel's as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. The wedding dress, which had felt so constricting inside, now seemed absurdly, dangerously conspicuous. It was a beacon, a shimmering white flag of her rebellion, marking her as a target. They stood on the top step of the church, and the silence that had reigned inside was replaced by the ordinary sounds of a Saturday afternoon in Harmony Creek. The distant drone of a tractor, the laughter of children playing, the lazy chirp of sparrows. But the ordinariness of the sounds only highlighted the extraordinariness of their situation. Behind them, a life of wealth, security, and crushing conformity lay in ruins. Before them lay, what? An unwritten page, a terrifying, exhilarating void. Samuel's grip on her hand tightened, a silent question. Where can we go? The question was stark in its simplicity. Where, in a town that was owned body and soul by the Finch family, could they possibly go? Every door would be closed to them. Every face would be turned against them. They were fugitives in their own home. "My father's store," Eleanor said, the words coming out before she had even fully formed the thought. "It's closed on a Saturday afternoon. No one will be there." It wasn't a sanctuary, but it was a temporary refuge, a place to think, to breathe, to try and comprehend the cataclysm they had unleashed. They didn't run, they walked. Down the church steps, past the gleaming, beribboned automobiles of the wedding guests, and onto the main street. Their progress was a spectacle. People stopped on the sidewalks, their mouths agape. Faces appeared in the windows of shops and houses. A white woman in a wedding dress, hand in hand with a black man. It was a sight so profoundly taboo, so far outside the established order of things, that it seemed to stun people into immobility. The whispers followed them like a swarm of insects, a rising tide of shock, outrage, and condemnation. Eleanor felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her skin. She had never been the subject of public scorn before. All her life, she had been a good girl, the quiet, respectable daughter of the town grocer. Now, in the space of 10 minutes, she had become a pariah, a traitor to her family, her town, her race. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible, but Samuel's presence beside her was a source of unexpected strength. He walked with his head held high, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He had lived his entire life under the weight of this town's judgment. He knew how to bear it. He was teaching her. Vance's grocery was only 3 blocks from the church, but it felt like a journey of 1,000 miles. When they finally reached the familiar green-painted storefront, Eleanor fumbled in the small satin purse that still dangled from her wrist. She didn't know why she had even brought it, but now she thanked God she had. The key to the back door was inside. They slipped into the narrow alley that ran alongside the building. The air here was cool and smelled of damp earth and discarded vegetable crates. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. Samuel gently took it from her, his steady hand turning the key with a decisive click. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside into the cool, familiar darkness of the storeroom. The storeroom smelled of sawdust, burlap, and coffee beans, the scent of her entire childhood. Samuel closed the door behind them, and the sounds of the street faded away, leaving them in a blessed, womb-like silence. For a moment they just stood there, their chests heaving, the adrenaline of the last half hour slowly beginning to recede. Eleanor leaned back against a stack of flour sacks, the fine satin of her dress instantly covered in a fine white dust. She looked at Samuel, really looked at him, for the first time without the pressure of 100 hostile eyes. The lines on his face were deeper than she had imagined. The light in his eyes, which had burned so brightly in the church, was now banked, revealing a profound and bone-deep weariness. He looked like a man who had been traveling for a very, very long time and had only just reached a destination he wasn't sure he would find. 5 years, she whispered, the words a knot of pain in her throat. "Oh, Samuel, what did they do to you?" He gave a small, humorless shake of his head. "Nothing I didn't survive." He reached out and gently touched the scar above his eye. "You get used to it. The beatings, the solitary, the endless empty days. The worst part, The worst part was not knowing if you were getting my letters, not knowing if you were still waiting. After they took my mail, I had to live on faith alone. I just had to believe that you were still you, that the Ellie I knew wouldn't just give up on me. His words were a knife in her heart. She had given up on him. She had lost faith. The shame of it washed over her, hot and sickening. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears finally beginning to stream down her face, leaving clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I waited for so long. The silence, it just went on and on. My mother said, everyone said you had forgotten me. After a while, it was easier to believe them than to keep hoping. I don't blame you, Ellie," he said, his voice soft. "How could you have known? They built a wall of silence around me. They buried me alive." He looked around the storeroom at the familiar, comforting clutter of her father's business. "They released me 3 days ago, put me on a bus with $20 and a suit of clothes that didn't fit. The first thing I did when I got to the bus station back in town was ask after you. Old man Hemlock down at the barber shop. He's the one who told me. He told me today was your wedding day, to a Finch." He shook his head again, a look of grim wonder on his face. "I almost didn't come. I swear I almost just got back on a bus and disappeared. What right did I have to ruin your life? You'd found a new one, a better one. But then I thought about my promise, and I thought about you, and I knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try. I had to look you in the eye and know for sure that you were the one who had made the choice, not them." The raw, desperate courage of his decision stunned her. He had walked into that church fully expecting to be rejected, arrested, or worse. He had done it simply to honor a 5-year-old promise, to give her back the choice that had been stolen from them both. If Samuel's courage in this moment has moved you, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue to honor souls as resilient as his. "It wasn't a better life, Samuel," she said, her voice choked with tears. "It was just an easier one. It was a life where I didn't have to feel anything. Being with you, it was the only time in my life I ever felt truly alive. The last 5 years, I've just been sleeping." He took a step closer and then another until he was standing right in front of her. He gently reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her, a current that had been dormant for 5 long years. "You're awake now, Ellie," he whispered. In that moment, in the dusty, silent storeroom, the years of pain and misunderstanding dissolved. He was her Samuel, and she was his Ellie. He leaned in and kissed her, and it was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of anger and forgiveness, a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and a fierce, unquenchable hope. It was a kiss that reclaimed everything that had been stolen from them. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The future was still a terrifying unknown, but for the first time, it was their unknown. They were together. They would face it together. But the real world could not be kept at bay for long. A loud, insistent banging on the front door of the store shattered their fragile peace. It was followed by her father's voice, raw with panic. "Eleanor, I know you're in there. Open this door." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She looked at Samuel, her eyes wide with fear. "My father, you have to face him sometime," Samuel said, his voice calm, his hand finding hers again. "We have to face them all." She nodded, took a deep breath, and together they walked from the storeroom into the main part of the grocery. The store was dim, the shades drawn against the afternoon sun. She walked to the front door, her wedding dress sweeping dust from the worn wooden floorboards. She turned the bolt and pulled it open. Her father stood on the sidewalk, his face a mess of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and a deep paternal pain. Behind him, parked at the curb, was Alistair's gleaming black car, and standing beside it, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud, was Alistair himself. The confrontation she had fled had followed her. There was nowhere left to run. Her father, John Vance, a man whose gentle nature had been weathered by a lifetime of quiet struggle, looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last hour. His eyes, usually a soft, kind blue, were now wide with a frantic, pleading terror. He looked past Eleanor, his gaze falling on Samuel standing in the shadows of the store, and a pained, guttural sound escaped his lips. "Eleanor, what have you done?" he rasped, his voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what you have done to us?" He stepped inside, grabbing her by the shoulders, his grip surprisingly strong. "You have to fix this now, before it's too late. You will come outside, you will apologize to Alistair, and you will get in that car and go with him. We can smooth this over. We can say you had a moment of feminine panic, a bridal swoon. People will talk, but they will forget. The Finches will forget if you make this right." Every word was a plea, a desperate attempt to rewind time, to stuff the truth back into the Pandora's box she had just flung open. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing his life's work, his small, precarious business, his wife's fragile peace of mind, all of it teetering on the brink of an abyss, and he believed she was the one who had pushed it there. Before Eleanor could form a reply, Alistair Finch strode into the store, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the small space. His tailored wedding suit was still immaculate, but his face was mottled with a rage he was no longer trying to conceal. His eyes, cold and blue, flickered over Samuel with a look of pure loathing before settling on Eleanor. "A bridal swoon, Mr. Vance?" Alistair said, his voice a silken, venomous sneer. "I think we are far beyond that. Your daughter has made a public spectacle of herself and my family. She has humiliated me in front of the entire town. And for what?" He gestured dismissively toward Samuel. "For him, a common field hand, a jailbird." Samuel stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on Eleanor, waiting for her to lead. He would not fight her battles for her unless she asked him to. This was her ground to defend, and defend it she did. A cold, clarifying anger washed through her, burning away the last of her fear. "His name is Samuel Barnes," she said, her voice low and steady, pulling away from her father's grasp. "And he is not a criminal. He is a soldier who was wronged by a system that you and your family benefit from every single day." She looked directly at Alistair, her gaze unwavering. "And I did not humiliate you, Alistair. I saved myself. I cannot and I will not marry a man I do not love, a man whose family would go to such lengths to secure their own happiness at the expense of others." Huddis, Alistair let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Love? You think this is about love? This is about survival. This is about the way the world works, Eleanor. A lesson you have clearly failed to learn." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate, menacing whisper. "Let me teach you. Your father's store runs on credit. Credit that my father's bank extends to him out of the goodness of our hearts. His suppliers, the wholesalers he depends on, they all have accounts at our bank. One phone call, Eleanor. That's all it would take. One phone call and your father would be ruined by Monday morning. The goodness of our hearts has its limits." The threat, which his father had made implicitly in the church, was now laid bare, brutal and explicit. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Her father flinched as if he had been struck. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes begging her to understand, to surrender. This was the reality he lived with every day, the precarious balance of his existence, and Alistair was threatening to kick the props out from under him. But the threat had an unintended effect. Instead of terrorizing Eleanor into submission, it solidified her resolve. This was the Finch way. This was the power they wielded, not just money, but fear. They owned the town, not just financially, but emotionally, and she refused to be a part of it. She refused to be the price of her father's solvency. "Then let him be ruined," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. But she said them anyway. She turned to her father, her heart breaking for the pain she was about to cause him, but knowing it was a necessary pain, a clean break instead of a slow poisoning. "Papa, I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, but I cannot live a lie. I cannot build my life on the foundation of Samuel's stolen years. If the price of my freedom is this store, then we will pay it. We will start over. We'll find another way." John Vance stared at his daughter, at the fierce, determined woman who stood before him, a stranger in the familiar form of his child. He looked at the wedding dress, now streaked with dust, a symbol of the future he had so desperately wanted for her, for them, and in his eyes, a flicker of something long dormant seemed to ignite. It was the memory of his own youth, of the man he had been before the weight of debt and worry had ground him down. He had once been a man of principle. He slowly straightened his shoulders. He looked from Alistair's sneering face to Eleanor's resolute one, and then he looked at Samuel, who had watched the entire exchange with a quiet, watchful intensity. He saw not the town's caricature of a dangerous outcast, but a young man standing with quiet dignity beside the woman he clearly loved. "The bank may own my books, Mr. Finch," John Vance said, his voice quiet but clear, finding a strength Eleanor hadn't heard in it for years. "But it does not own my daughter's soul, and it does not own mine." He turned to Eleanor. "This is your life to live, Eleanor. Not mine, not your mother's, yours." He then walked to the store's open door and held it, looking directly at Alistair. "I believe this is a private family matter now. I'd thank you to leave my store." Alistair was speechless. He had played his trump card, the ultimate weapon of financial annihilation, and it had failed. He had expected tears, begging, surrender. He had not expected this quiet, unified rebellion. For the first time in his pampered, privileged life, he was faced with something his money could not buy and his threats could not break: human dignity. His face turned a deep, ugly shade of red. He looked from John to Eleanor to Samuel, his eyes promising a future of unending retribution. "You will regret this," he snarled, his voice a low hiss. "All of you." He turned on his heel and stalked out of the store, slamming the door of his car and roaring away down the street, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury in his wake. The three of them stood in the silence of the store, the tension slowly ebbing away. The first battle was over. They had won, but the cost was immense. John Vance walked over to the front counter and sank onto a stool, burying his face in his hands. The burst of defiance had drained him, leaving him with the terrifying reality of what he had just done. He had stood up to the Finches. He had committed financial suicide. Eleanor went to him, putting a hand on his slumped shoulder. "Papa." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and terror. "Your mother," he said, his voice thick. "God help me, Eleanor. What am I going to tell your mother?" As if on cue, the storeroom door creaked open again. It was Eleanor's mother, Mary Vance. She must have come in the back way, while they were focused on the confrontation at the front. Her face was pale, her eyes red from weeping, but she was no longer hysterical. She was holding a large canvas satchel. She walked directly to Eleanor, ignoring the two men. She looked at the expensive, ruined wedding dress. "You can't go anywhere in that," she said, her voice brittle but practical. She held out the satchel. "I packed you some things. A sensible dress, your walking shoes, the money from the silver teapot your grandmother left you. It's not much, but it's yours." Eleanor stared at her mother, stunned. She had expected recriminations, tears, accusations. She had not expected this quiet, practical act of support. Mary Vance looked at her husband, then at Samuel. Her expression was not one of approval, not yet. It was one of grim, pained acceptance. "I heard what Mr. Finch said," she stated flatly. "I heard what you said, John. You were right." She looked back at Eleanor, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I wanted you to be safe. I wanted you to have a life without the worry that has been a shadow over ours. But I never wanted you to be a prisoner. I was wrong to push you. A mother's love shouldn't be a cage." She took a deep breath. "You cannot stay here, Eleanor. Neither of you can." She looked at Samuel now, addressing him directly for the first time in her life. "The Finches will not let this go. They will make this town a living hell for you. You have to leave tonight." Her words were a death knell for the life they had known, but also a blessing, a release. She was giving them permission to go, to save themselves. Eleanor threw her arms around her mother, the stiff lace of the dress pressing against her. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered, her voice choked with a gratitude so immense it was painful. Her mother hugged her back, a fierce, protective embrace. "Be happy, Eleanor," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "That's all I ever truly wanted. Just be happy." And so, in the back room of the grocery store, surrounded by the mundane artifacts of her childhood, Eleanor Vance stripped off the beautiful, suffocating wedding dress, the symbol of her stolen future. She folded it carefully and laid it on a crate, a final, respectful farewell to the woman she was supposed to have been. She changed into a simple cotton dress and sturdy shoes, the clothes of a woman who was going on a journey. When she emerged, Samuel was waiting. He looked at her, and his smile was the first, truly happy, unburdened expression she had seen on his face. He reached for her hand. It was time to go. They had no plan, no destination, and almost no money. All they had was each other and a future they would have to build from scratch, somewhere far away from the poisoned soil of Harmony Creek. The escape from Harmony Creek was a clandestine operation executed under the cloak of a gathering twilight. John Vance, his earlier despair now channeled into a quiet, methodical efficiency, insisted on driving them. "The bus station will be the first place they look for you," he'd said, his voice low and firm. "Alistair is a spiteful boy, but his father is a dangerous man. He'll have the sheriff watching the roads out of town. We have to be smarter than that." Their chariot was not a getaway car, but the familiar, slightly battered Ford pickup truck John used for hauling produce. Eleanor and Samuel huddled in the back, concealed beneath a dusty canvas tarp amidst empty vegetable crates that still smelled faintly of sweet corn and Georgia soil. It was a cramped, undignified hiding place, but it was safe. Peering through a small gap in the tarp, Eleanor watched the familiar landmarks of her hometown slide by like scenes from a dream. The town square, with its silent, stone-faced Confederate soldier. The movie house, whose marquee still advertised the picture she and Alistair had seen on their last date. The corner soda shop, where she and her friends had shared countless giggles and secrets. It was her entire world, and she was leaving it like a thief in the night. John drove, with a deliberate, almost casual slowness, taking a winding route through the back roads that crisscrossed the county. He avoided the main highway, sticking to the dusty lanes that ran between fields of cotton and tobacco. Twice, they saw the distant headlights of Sheriff Miller's patrol car, a slow-moving predator scanning the main arteries out of town. Each time, John would pull the truck into a darkened grove of pine trees, cutting the engine, and they would wait, hearts pounding in the sudden, insect-humming silence until the danger had passed. During one of these enforced stops, lying in the darkness, Eleanor felt Samuel's hand find hers. His touch was warm and reassuring. "Are you scared?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath against the chirping of the crickets. "Terrified," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I feel like I've jumped off a cliff without knowing if there's water below." "There's water," he said with a quiet certainty. "It might be cold, and it might be deep, but I'll be in it with you. We'll learn to swim." His simple faith was a balm to her frayed nerves. He had survived 5 years in a place designed to crush the human spirit. If he could face the future with such calm resolve, then so could she. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise. After what felt like an eternity, John finally pulled the truck to a stop. "This is as far as I can take you," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he pulled back the tarp. They were at a deserted crossroads, miles from any town, marked only by a faded sign pointing north toward the state line. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and distant rain. They climbed out of the truck, their limbs stiff. In the dim moonlight, Eleanor could see the deep lines of worry etched on her father's face. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and pressed a small wad of bills into her hand. "It's not much," he said, echoing her mother's words. "It's everything I had in the house, don't argue." He then turned to Samuel and looked him squarely in the eye, man to man. "You protect her," he said. It wasn't a question or a request, it was a command, a transfer of responsibility. "The world is not a kind place for people like you two. You'll have to look out for each other." "I will, sir," Samuel replied, his voice filled with a solemn gravity. "With my life." John Vance nodded. Satisfied, he embraced Eleanor, holding her tightly for a long moment. "Be good, Ellie girl," he whispered, using a childhood nickname she hadn't heard in years. "Write to your mother when you can, when it's safe. Let us know you're all right." He released her, cleared his throat gruffly, and climbed back into the truck without another word, as if his emotional reserves were completely spent. He didn't look back as he drove away, the truck's red taillights shrinking in the darkness until they were swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. They were alone. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the wind rustling through the tall pines that lined the road. They stood at a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, with a handful of money, a small satchel of clothes, and a future that was a complete and utter blank. "Well," Samuel said, breaking the silence, a hint of a smile in his voice. "Which way, ma'am? North or further north?" His attempt at levity was a gift, and Eleanor accepted it gratefully. "I've always been partial to further north," she said, managing a small smile of her own. They began to walk, their footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. They walked for hours, their shared adrenaline giving way to a deep, numbing exhaustion. They talked as they walked, not about the future, which was too vast and frightening to contemplate, but about the past. He told her more about his time in Leavenworth, not the brutal details, but the small strategies of survival. The way he learned to read men's eyes, the friendships forged in silence over a shared cigarette, the mental discipline of memorizing entire books to keep his mind sharp. He spoke of it not with self-pity, but with the detached air of a soldier describing a long and difficult campaign. And Eleanor, in turn, told him about her 5 years. She told him about the suffocating loneliness, the slow erosion of her hope, the pressure from her family, and the empty, hollow feeling of her engagement to Alistair. She confessed her weakness, her loss of faith in him, expecting him to be angry or hurt. But he listened with a quiet, compassionate understanding. "You survived too, Ellie," he said when she had finished. "We were both in a prison. Mine just had bars you could see." Sometime after midnight, the rumble of an approaching truck broke the monotony. It was a large, battered flatbed, loaded with lumber, and as it drew near, it slowed. The driver, a weary-looking man with a kind face, leaned out of the passenger side window. "You folks in some kind of trouble?" he called out. "Just trying to get north, sir," Samuel replied. The man studied them for a long moment, taking in Eleanor's simple dress and Samuel's worn clothes. He saw a young couple on the run, though he couldn't have guessed the details. "Well, I'm heading up to Chattanooga," he said. "It ain't fancy, but it's a ride. Hop in the back." The journey to Chattanooga was cold and windswept, but they were filled with a profound sense of gratitude. Huddled together for warmth behind a stack of lumber, with the moonlit landscape of Georgia rushing by, Eleanor felt the last ties to her old life finally breaking. Harmony Creek, the Finches, the wedding that wasn't, it was all behind them now, a fading dream. They arrived in Chattanooga as the first grey light of dawn was breaking over the city. It was a world away from their small town, a sprawling industrial city of smokestacks, train yards, and anonymous bustling crowds. The truck driver let them off near the bus station with a gruff, "Good luck to you," and rumbled away, leaving them on a grimy street corner. They were a strange and conspicuous pair, a white woman and a black man, traveling together in an era and a place where such a thing was not just frowned upon, but actively dangerous. They drew stares, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. The unspoken laws of Harmony Creek were not confined to its borders. They were woven into the very fabric of the South. They found a small, dingy diner that was open and slid into a booth at the back. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with a cigarette dangling from her lips, took their order with a look that managed to convey both indifference and disapproval. As Eleanor sipped the weak, bitter coffee, the full reality of their situation began to sink in. They were not just starting over, they were exiles. They had no friends, no connections, no one to vouch for them. Samuel's prison record, a mark of his courage to her, would be a brand of shame to any potential employer. And her presence at his side would only make things more difficult, closing doors that might have otherwise been open to him. "What do we do now, Sam?" she asked, her voice small. He was looking out the window at the people hurrying past on the sidewalk. "We find work," he said, with a practicality that belied the immense difficulty of the task. "Any work. We find a room, and we build, brick by brick, just like you said." He reached across the table and took her hand. "The difference is, this time, we're building it together." And so began their new life. It was a life of grinding, soul-crushing hardship. They found a single, cramped room in a boarding house in the colored section of town, the only place that would rent to them. It was a grim, depressing space, with peeling wallpaper and a window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was theirs. Samuel spent his days days going from factory to warehouse to construction site, looking for any kind of manual labor. He was strong and a hard worker, but the moment a potential employer learned of his record or simply saw Eleanor waiting for him across the street, the answer was always the same: a curt shake of the head. Eleanor, too, searched for work. She tried the department stores, the restaurants, the secretarial pools. But a white woman living in the colored district was an anomaly, a scandal. The women who interviewed her looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They asked probing, insulting questions about her situation, and the job was never available. The small amount of money her parents had given them dwindled with alarming speed. They ate one meal a day, saving every penny for the rent. The bright, hopeful flame that had been kindled in the church began to flicker, threatened by the cold, hard winds of reality. The world, it turned out, was a far crueler and more unforgiving place than they had ever imagined. The first few weeks in Chattanooga bled into a month, and the month began to feel like a lifetime. Their existence became a harsh, repetitive rhythm of rejection and hunger. The city that had initially seemed like a place of anonymous escape now felt like a vast, indifferent prison of its own. Every closed door, every suspicious glance, every muttered insult on the street was a reminder of their status as outsiders, as transgressors against an unspoken social code. The hope that had fueled their flight from Harmony Creek was being ground down by the daily, abrasive reality of their situation. Eleanor watched with a growing, aching helplessness as the strain began to wear on Samuel. The quiet confidence he had shown in the church was being eroded, replaced by a grim, tight-lipped frustration. He would leave their small room each morning before dawn, his shoulders squared, a look of determination on his face. But he would return late each evening, his body slumped with exhaustion, his face a mask of defeat. He never complained, but she could see the toll it was taking. The light in his eyes, the light she had cherished for so long, was dimming. He was a man of immense strength and pride, and the enforced idleness, the constant humiliation of being turned away, was a poison to his soul. She tried to be a source of comfort, to keep their small, grim room as clean and welcoming as possible, to stretch their meager food supplies into something that resembled a meal. But her own rejections were a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She was educated, she was articulate, she was a hard worker, but none of it mattered. In the eyes of the world, she was a woman who had made an incomprehensible choice, a woman who had willingly stepped outside the protective walls of her race and class, and for that, she was to be punished. The pitying, contemptuous looks she received from potential employers were, in some ways, worse than the outright hostility. They made her feel like a fool, a fallen woman who deserved her fate. Their conversations, once filled with shared memories and hopeful plans, became strained. They began to avoid talking about the future because it was a landscape of impenetrable fog. They avoided talking about the past because it was a reminder of a world, however flawed, where they had belonged. The silence in their small room was often heavy with unspoken fears. What if this was it? What if they had escaped one trap only to fall into another, larger one? The thought that she had dragged Samuel into this, that he would have been better off disappearing on that bus, began to haunt Eleanor's waking moments. One sweltering evening in late July, Samuel came home later than usual. Eleanor had been waiting for hours, her anxiety a tight knot in her stomach. When he finally walked through the door, she knew instantly that something was different. He was not just tired, he was beaten. There was a dark, ugly bruise swelling on his left cheekbone, and his lip was split and bleeding. She rushed to him, her heart seizing with fear. "Samuel, what happened? Who did this to you?" He sank heavily onto the edge of their narrow bed, avoiding her eyes. "It's nothing, Ellie, just some trouble down at the rail yard." But she knew it was more than that. She gently took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Tell me," she insisted, her voice soft but unyielding. He finally met her gaze, and the despair in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "There was a foreman," he began, his voice a low, rough monotone. "A white man. He was hiring for a loading crew, day labor. He looked right past me, picked 3 other colored men who were standing behind me. I asked him why. I told him I was stronger than any of them. He just laughed. He said he didn't hire jailbirds. The word gets around, Ellie. I don't know how, but it does. It's like a brand on my forehead. He took a ragged breath. Then he said he especially didn't hire jailbirds who thought they were good enough for a white woman. He said some other things, ugly things, about you. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. I tried to walk away, Samuel continued, his voice thick with a shame that was not his to bear. I swear I did, but he kept on. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove to the other men that he could say anything he wanted to me, and I'd just have to take it. And I couldn't. I couldn't let him talk about you that way. He looked down at his own powerful hands, clenched into fists on his knees. I didn't even hit him that hard, just once, to make him stop. But his men, they were on me in a second, 3 of them. Eleanor gently dabbed his split lip with a damp cloth, her tears falling onto his bruised skin. This was the Finch's revenge, she realized. It wasn't direct, not an order from on high. It was something more insidious. It was the system they represented, the poison they had poured into the very groundwater of this society. A man like that foreman at the rail yard didn't need to be told by Harrison Finch to hate Samuel. He did it naturally. The Finches hadn't created the system, but they were its masters, its beneficiaries, and their influence spread like a stain, ensuring that wherever Samuel went, the doors would be closed and the fists would be ready. That night, as Samuel slept a fitful, exhausted sleep, Eleanor lay awake, staring into the darkness. The despair she had been fighting for weeks finally overwhelmed her. They were going to be destroyed. This slow, grinding poverty, this constant humiliation, would eventually break them both. Samuel's spirit, his greatest strength, was being systematically dismantled, and she was the cause. Her presence at his side, the very symbol of their love and defiance, was the anchor that was dragging him down. A terrible, cold clarity settled over her. She knew what she had to do. It was the hardest, most painful decision of her life, a decision that felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for. But she saw no other way. If she loved him, truly loved him, she had to save him. And the only way to save him was to leave him. Alone, he would be just another black man looking for work. He would still face prejudice, but he would no longer be a spectacle, a walking scandal. Without her, the foreman at the rail yard would have no ammunition, no target for his ugliest insults. Without her, Samuel could become anonymous again. He could find a small place for himself in the world, a foothold on which to start climbing. With her, he was doomed. The decision was an act of brutal, self-inflicted surgery. She was cutting away a part of her own soul, but she believed it was necessary. She would be the one to break the promise this time, not out of weakness or lack of faith, but out of a desperate, protective love. She rose before dawn while he was still asleep. Her movements were silent, ghost-like. She took the small canvas satchel her mother had given her, the one she'd arrived with. She looked at their few meager possessions, his spare shirt, her other dress, the worn copy of a book he'd been reading. There was nothing to take. She had nothing but the clothes on her back. She sat at the small, rickety table and wrote him a letter. Her hand trembled, and the tears she had held back all night now flowed freely, spotting the cheap paper. My dearest Samuel, forgive me. I am leaving because I love you too much to stay. I thought our love would be a shield, but I was wrong. It is a target, and you are the one who is taking all the arrows. I cannot stand by and watch this world destroy you because of me. You are the strongest, best man I have ever known, and you deserve a chance to build a life, a real life, not this half-life of struggle and humiliation we are living. Go somewhere new. Start over. Forget me. Find a good woman who can stand by your side without bringing the whole world's hatred down on you. Be happy, my love. That is all I ask. Know that for a few brief, shining moments, you made me feel more alive than I ever thought possible. That will be enough for me. Yours always, Ellie. She folded the note and placed it on his pillow next to his sleeping face. She allowed herself one last look at him, memorizing the shape of his jaw, the gentle curve of his lips, the scar above his eye. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to his bruised cheek, a kiss so light it was little more than a breath. Then, without a backward glance, she slipped out of the room, out of the boarding house, and into the grey, pre-dawn streets of Chattanooga. She didn't know where she was going. She had no money, no plan. She was walking back into the same void she had faced on that dark country road, but this time she was utterly and completely alone. The world without Samuel was a landscape drained of all color. Eleanor walked away from the boarding house as the city was stirring to life, a gray, anonymous figure in a sea of gray, anonymous faces. Every step was an act of physical will, a painful tearing away from the only source of warmth and light she had known. The letter she had left on his pillow felt like a stone in her heart. She had written the words, "Forget me," but she knew it was a command she herself could never obey. He was imprinted on her soul. Her only instinct was to put as much distance as possible between herself and the life she had just shattered. She found her way to the bus station, a place that now seemed to be the bookend of her brief, tumultuous new life. She didn't have the money for a ticket, not to anywhere meaningful, but she remembered the stories Samuel had told her, stories of the vast, invisible network of people who lived on the margins, who knew the rhythms of the road. She found a group of itinerant workers huddled near the loading docks behind the station, men with weathered faces and bundles of possessions, waiting for a ride, for a rumor of work, for a handout. She approached an older woman who sat slightly apart from the men, her face a roadmap of hard miles. "I need to go north," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't have any money." The woman looked her up and down, taking in her clean but simple dress, her pale, tear-streaked face, the desperate fear in her eyes. She saw a girl in a world of trouble, a story she had seen 100 times before. She didn't ask for details. She simply gave a curt nod toward a line of trucks idling nearby. "That one," she said, pointing with her chin. "The green one with the canvas top. He's hauling furniture to Chicago. He'll take on riders for a few bucks or a sad story. You look like you got both." And so Eleanor left the South. Huddled in the back of a rumbling, rattling truck, surrounded by the ghostly sheet-covered forms of other people's furniture, she watched the rolling hills of Tennessee give way to the flat plains of Kentucky and Indiana. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and grief. She didn't speak to the other riders, a silent, grim-faced man and a young boy. She simply stared out at the passing landscape, her mind a numb, aching void. She was running away from the problem, but the problem was inside her. She was the problem. She arrived in Chicago 2 days later, disoriented, filthy, and utterly alone. The city was a roaring, overwhelming beast of steel and stone, a place of such immense scale and indifference that it made her feel smaller and more insignificant than ever before. Chattanooga's hostility had been personal. Chicago's indifference was a crushing, impersonal force. Her first few weeks in the city were a desperate scramble for survival. She slept in train stations and church doorways, always moving, always vigilant. She learned the harsh calculus of hunger, the rhythms of the soup kitchens, the places where a person could find a moment's warmth without being hassled. She tried to find work, but the story was the same as it had been in Chattanooga, only now she was competing with thousands of others who were just as desperate. She was a woman alone, without references, without a history, and the men who offered her work were not interested in her skills as a typist or a bookkeeper. One evening, shivering on a bench in a small park, she reached a point of absolute despair. The small flame of her will to survive had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember. She was cold, she was hungry, and she was so profoundly lonely that it felt like a physical illness. She thought of Samuel. She wondered if he had found her letter, if he had hated her or understood, if he had left Chattanooga, if he was safe. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she truly understood the temptation of simply giving up, of letting the cold and the hunger and the indifference of the world have their way with her. It was a voice that saved her, a woman's voice, sharp but not unkind. "You can't sleep here, honey. The bulls will run you in, and you don't want to see the inside of a Chicago jail." Eleanor opened her eyes. A woman was standing over her. She was a stout, middle-aged black woman with intelligent, assessing eyes and a no-nonsense set to her jaw. She was dressed in a clean but worn coat and held a string bag of groceries. I have nowhere to go," Eleanor stammered. The woman looked at her for a long moment, her gaze taking in Eleanor's thin coat, her worn-out shoes, the desperation on her face. "You got people?" Family? Eleanor just shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The woman let out a heavy sigh, a sound of weary exasperation with the world and all its broken people. Well, hell, she muttered, more to herself than to Eleanor. I must have sucker written on my forehead. She looked at Eleanor again. My name is Hattie. I run a boarding house a few blocks from here. I got a small room in the attic. Ain't much more than a closet, but it's warm and it's clean. You can work for your keep. Cooking, cleaning. You look like you know one end of a broom from the other. Eleanor could only stare, speechless. It was an act of such unexpected, unearned kindness that it felt like a miracle. Why? She finally managed to ask. You don't know me? I know the look of a soul on the edge, Hattie said, her voice softening slightly. And the good Lord knows, I've been there myself a time or two. Everybody needs a hand up sometime. Now, are you coming, or are you going to sit there and freeze? Hattie's boarding house was a lifeline. It was a tall, narrow building on the south side, filled with the sounds and smells of life, the clatter of pots and pans, the murmur of conversation, the scent of Hattie's legendary stew. The other boarders were a collection of working men and women, people who lived hard lives, but who treated Eleanor with a gruff but genuine kindness. For the first time since leaving Harmony Creek, she was part of a community. She threw herself into the work, grateful for the physical exhaustion that kept her mind from dwelling on the past. She scrubbed floors, washed mountains of laundry, and helped Hattie in the kitchen, slowly learning the secrets of her cooking. Hattie was a demanding but fair taskmistress. She was tough, sharp-tongued, and deeply compassionate. She never asked Eleanor about her past, but Eleanor knew that the older woman saw everything with her wise, knowing eyes. One evening, as they were sitting in the kitchen after the boarders had been fed, Hattie finally broke the unspoken rule. You're running from something, child, she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. And it ain't just poverty. You got the look of a woman who's carrying a ghost on her back. And so, Eleanor told her, she told her everything about Harmony Creek, about Samuel, about the wedding, the escape, the crushing hardship in Chattanooga, and the terrible, painful decision she had made. She cried as she spoke, releasing months of pent-up grief and guilt. Hattie listened in silence, her expression unreadable, simply letting her talk until the story was all out. When Eleanor finished, her voice a raw whisper, Hattie was quiet for a long time. She took a sip of her chicory coffee, her gaze distant. You know, she said finally, what you did, running away from that man of yours, it was the act of a coward. Eleanor flinched, the words striking her like a slap. But, Hattie continued, holding up a hand, it was also the act of the bravest woman I ever heard of. It takes a fool to run into a burning building to save someone. And it takes a certain kind of brave, loving fool to walk away from the only thing in the world that keeps you warm, because you think it'll save them from the fire. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. The question is, child, did it work? Did you actually save him, or did you just leave him to burn alone? Hattie's words were a brutal, necessary tonic. Had she saved him, or had she simply abandoned him to a different kind of despair? In her grief and panic, she had made a unilateral decision, convinced it was for his own good. She had taken his choice away from him, just as the Finches and the army had done before. She had assumed he was not strong enough to fight for their life together. She had mistaken her own fear for his weakness. The realization was a slow, dawning horror. What if he hadn't wanted to be saved in that way? What if he would have preferred to face the world's hatred with her at his side, rather than face a life of quiet safety without her? She had acted out of love, but it was a fearful, controlling love, not a true and trusting one. What have I done? She whispered, the full weight of her mistake crashing down on her. What's done is done, Hattie said, her voice gentle now. The past is a rock. You can't move it. But the future is water. It flows. You can change its course. She leaned forward, her expression intense. Do you love this man, Eleanor? More than my own life, Eleanor said without hesitation. And do you believe he is a man of strength, a man of honor, a man who can fight his own battles? He's the strongest man I know, she said, a new conviction rising in her voice. Then what in God's name are you doing scrubbing my floors in Chicago? Hattie demanded, her voice rising with a fierce, challenging energy. You made a mistake, a big, beautiful, heartbreaking mistake. So what? You think life gives you a prize for getting it right the first time? You go back there. You find him, you get down on your hands and knees, and you beg his forgiveness, and then you stand up, you take his hand, and you start fighting, not by running away, but by standing your ground, together. Hattie's words were a clarion call, a shock to Eleanor's soul. She had been so lost in her own grief and guilt that she had forgotten how to fight. She had forgotten the woman who had walked out of that church, the woman who had defied the Finches, the woman who had chosen love over safety. Hattie was giving her that woman back. A new resolve, a true and powerful hope began to fill the empty spaces in her heart. Hattie was right. The past was a rock, but the future was water. And she would be damned if she was going to let it flow on without Samuel in it. She had to go back. She had to find him. It was a terrifying, almost impossible task. He could be anywhere, but for the first time in a long time, she had a direction. She had a mission. She had to undo the greatest mistake of her life. The journey back south was a pilgrimage fueled by a desperate, fragile hope. It was a complete reversal of her flight north, not just in direction, but in spirit. Before, she had been running away from a life she thought she was destroying. Now, she was running toward a life she was determined to reclaim. Hattie, in her infinite, gruff wisdom, had not only given her the courage to go back, but also the means. She'd pressed a small, thick envelope into Eleanor's hand, containing a month's wages Eleanor hadn't known she'd been earning, along with a sizable contribution from Hattie's own meager savings. "You pay me back when you can," she'd said, waving off Eleanor's tearful protests. "Just send me a picture from your wedding, the real one, this time." Eleanor took a bus, a slow, rattling vessel that seemed to travel not just through space but back in time. With every mile that passed, the manicured fields of the Midwest gave way to the tangled, kudzu-choked landscapes of the South. The air grew heavier, thicker with humidity and memory. The familiar accents of her fellow passengers, once a sound of home, now carried a faint underlying note of menace. She was returning to the scene of the crime, the place where her love was a transgression, and she felt a tremor of the old fear. But this time, the fear was secondary to her purpose. Her first stop was Chattanooga. It was a painful, necessary step. She went directly to the boarding house where they had lived, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The landlady, a sour-faced woman who barely remembered her, confirmed her worst fears. Samuel was gone. "He left a few days after you did," the woman said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "Paid his rent for the week and walked out with that little bundle of his. Good riddance to the both of you, I say. Never did like trouble." She couldn't or wouldn't say where he had gone. The trail was cold. Eleanor spent 2 days in the city, a ghost haunting her own past. She walked the streets they had walked, visited the diner where they had eaten their first meal, and even went to the rail yard where Samuel had been beaten. She spoke to anyone who would listen, showing a small, worn photograph of him she had carried all this time. A few men remembered him, the quiet, strong man who was always with the white woman, but no one knew where he had gone. He had simply vanished, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape of America. The despair she had felt in Chicago threatened to return, a cold, creeping tide. He could be anywhere, in Memphis, in New Orleans, in St. Louis. He could have gone west. The sheer impossibility of her task was overwhelming. She sat on a bench by the Tennessee River, watching the muddy water flow by, and considered giving up, returning to the grim safety of Hattie's kitchen. But then she thought of Samuel, of his unwavering faith, of his 5-year promise. He had believed in her, even when he was buried alive. She could not, would not give up on him now. She had to think like him. Where would he go? He wouldn't just wander aimlessly. He was a man of purpose, and his purpose, his entire life, was tied to one place. A place he had longed for and fled from in equal measure. A place where his roots ran deep, even if the soil was poisoned. Harmony Creek. The thought was terrifying. To return to that town was to walk directly back into the lion's den. The Finches would still be there, their power undiminished, their anger likely curdled into a long, simmering hatred. Her own family. She didn't know if they would welcome her or cast her out, but it was the only lead she had. It was the place where their story began, and she had a desperate, intuitive feeling that it was where she would find him, or at least find a trace of him. She bought a bus ticket to a town 20 miles north of Harmony Creek and walked the rest of the way, arriving on the outskirts of her hometown under the cover of darkness, just as she had left it. The town was smaller and shabbier than she remembered, the familiar buildings seeming to shrink under the weight of her new, worldly experience. She didn't go to her parents' house. She couldn't face them yet, not until she knew. Instead, she went to the one place in town that had always existed outside the Finch's direct control, the one place where Samuel was not just a sharecropper's son, but a man with a name and a history, the colored section of town across the river. She crossed the old wooden bridge, her footsteps echoing in the night. The houses here were small, unpainted clapboard structures, many with tin roofs and tidy, swept dirt yards. She could hear the sound of music from a juke joint, the murmur of late-night conversations from front porches. It was a world she had only ever glimpsed from a distance, and she felt like an intruder, her white skin a beacon in the darkness. She found the small, humble church where Samuel's family had always worshipped. The lights were off, but she could see a small parsonage next door with a single lamp burning in the window. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the steps and knocked. The door was opened by an elderly, silver-haired preacher, Reverend Brown. She recognized him from her childhood. He was a man who commanded immense respect in his community. He looked at her, his eyes sharp and questioning behind his spectacles, his expression a mixture of surprise and profound caution at the sight of a white woman on his doorstep in the middle of the night. "Reverend Brown," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm looking for Samuel Barnes. I was told he might have come back." The preacher's expression softened into one of deep, sorrowful recognition. He knew exactly who she was. Her story, no doubt, had become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered on both sides of the river. "You best come inside, child," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He led her into a small, cluttered study filled with books. He poured her a glass of water and waited for her to compose herself. "Is he here?" she asked, her voice filled with a hope so intense it was painful. The preacher shook his head slowly. "No, Miss Vance, he is not here, but he was." He leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together. "He came back about a month ago, a changed man, hardened, quiet. He came looking for you. When he found you were gone, when he heard from his folks that your own parents didn't know where you were, something in him seemed to break. He stayed for a week, helping his father in the fields, saying almost nothing. Then he was gone again. He said there was nothing left for him in this town." Eleanor's heart sank. She had missed him. She was a month too late. The cold trail had led to a dead end. "Did he say where he was going?" she asked, her last desperate hope fading. "He did not," the preacher said, but he hesitated, studying her face, seeming to weigh a decision. "He left something with me. He said, if you ever came back, if you were ever foolish enough or brave enough to come looking for him, that I was to give it to you." He rose and went to a small locked wooden box on his desk. He opened it with a key and took out a thick, sealed envelope. He handed it to her. Her name, Ellie, was written on the front in Samuel's strong, familiar hand. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. It was not a letter. It was a thick sheaf of papers, bound with a piece of string. The top page was a letter, but the pages beneath it were something else, covered in dense, official-looking text. She read the letter first. "My Ellie, if you are reading this, then I was wrong. I thought your leaving was the end of the story. I thought it meant you had finally woken up from our foolish dream. I came back here, to this place of ghosts, because I had to know for sure. When I found you gone, I believed them all. I believed the silence, I believed your mother, I believed the foreman at the rail yard. I believed you had finally done the sensible thing and saved yourself from me. But if you are here, if you came back, then I was a fool. I underestimated you. I underestimated us. I should have known your heart was as stubborn as my own. I am leaving this place. I cannot stay here and breathe the air of our past. I am going to find a new place, a place where the ground is not so sour. But I am not just wandering. I'm going on a mission. The papers with this letter will explain. In Leavenworth, I had a lot of time to think and a lot of time to listen. I met a man inside, an old lawyer, a colored man from up north who had been framed. He taught me things. He taught me about the law, not the law of men like Finch, but the real law, the one written in the books. He taught me how to fight back, not with my fists, but with paper and ink. What they did to me, to us, was not just cruel, Ellie, it was illegal. The chaplain who stole our letters, the officer who provoked me, they broke the army's own rules. My conviction was a sham. The papers I've enclosed are the beginning of my appeal. My lawyer friend gave me the names of people in Washington, people who help soldiers like me. It is a long, slow fight. It may take years. It may lead to nothing, but it is a fight I have to make. I cannot build a future on a foundation of lies. I have to clear my name. For me, for my father, and for you. I don't know where this fight will take me, but I am leaving you a map. Find Reverend Brown. He is a good man. He will know how to get word to me through a network of other preachers. It may take time, but a message will find me. If you still want this life, our life, then send me a message. Tell me where you are. And I swear to you, Ellie, on my soul, the moment my name is cleared, the moment I am a free and whole man in the eyes of the law, I will come for you. And this time, there is no one on God's green earth who will be able to stop us. Wait for me, just one more time. Yours always, Samuel. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so fierce and profound it was almost painful. He hadn't given up. He hadn't despaired. He had turned his pain into a weapon. He was fighting back. He had not forgotten her. He had been building a future worthy of her, and he had left a door open. He had left her a map. Their story was not over. It was just the beginning of a new, more difficult chapter. She looked up at Reverend Brown, a radiant, incandescent hope shining on her face. "Reverend," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I need to send a message. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the fire of these powerful memories will never be extinguished. Thank you."